Alright, here we are guys, back to normal scheduling for episode 9. I can't wait, looks like a fantastic battle card coming up. It's getting down to the wire now guys, the top 32 competition is looming, and these are the last few episodes before we get going with that. We've started to see some robots round out their fight night schedule. Last week we saw Tombstone fall to an unlikely 1-2. Scorpios pulled off an incredible victory there. Rotator might have just saved their season by defeating the Big Dill, who we probably won't be seeing in the top 32, despite them both being at 1-2. Jackpot goes 3-0 by defeating the legendary Lockjaw, definitely the newcomer of the season. Kraken and Huge both go 1-2. I think we can expect to see them there in the top 32. Ribot finishes their Fight Night campaign with an emphatic victory over Axolotl. Likewise with Fusion, both of those robots going at 2-1 as Fusion defeated War Easy, and Bloodsport eked out a judge's decision against Kronos as they make their way into their first ever post-season tournament. So, we've got a few more robots finishing their campaigns this episode, as everyone's either desperately trying to claw their way into the competition or trying to secure the highest seeding possible. This is my previews and predictions for episode 9. So here we go. This is the first of a few battles that feel like they might be a kind of win and you're in situation. It's Adam Wrigley's Shatter versus Brian Nave's Captain Shredderator. Both of these robots are at 1-1, meaning that this is an absolutely crucial fight in terms of shaping the top 32. Starting with Captain Shredderator, Brian Nave lost his first fight against Lockjaw all the way back in episode 1. Of course, no shame in losing to a legend. Captain Shredderator bounced back by defeating Axe Backwards in a fight where both robots seem to be running into some good form. This is probably Captain Shredderator's best season to date, with the loss against Lockjaw not being too bad itself. Despite smoking out against Lockjaw, the robot is looking more reliable and is dishing out the same amount of damage that it's always been capable of. So this can be an absolutely deadly combination. Shatter has had a very similar run. Much like Captain Shredderator, it has defeated a robot that is currently at 0-2 and been beaten by one that has ended up 2-1. When you look at the two robots, however, the similarities end there. Captain Shredderator has been a bit of a glass cannon in the past, and Shatter, despite the name and the theme, has been anything but. Shatter is one of the toughest robots in the competition, and has stood up to some of the nastiest spinners out there without ever really breaking down. The only time it has been knocked out was by Minotaur when the hammer died and they couldn't self-right. So Brian Nave definitely has his work cut out for him. Captain Shredderator has fought a couple of hammerbots in the past. First of all, you have Chomp, who was much too tough to crack, and ended up knocking out Captain Shredderator with that hammer. Blacksmith, on the other hand, didn't quite have the same firepower, but it was tough enough to survive the early blows and outlast Captain Shredderator's weapon. However, the question here is how much more durable is Captain Shredderator's weapon? Brian Nave has changed the system back to an older fashioned yet more reliable setup, so it seems that Shatter is going to have to survive quite a few more blows than Blacksmith did back in Season 4. So I suspect Brian Nave will implement those Freedom Wings once more. Anything to deter Adam Wrigley from firing that weapon is a good idea because it's a powerful hammer, so I don't see why we wouldn't see that. I actually think this fight will come down to a judge's decision. I'm not sure if Captain Shredderator's weapon will survive the entire fight, however, it will probably survive long enough to do a lot of damage to Shatter, perhaps not enough to knock it out because it is a very tough robot. And on the other hand, look, while that hammer is powerful, I don't know if Captain Shredderator will take too much damage from it throughout the fight. I think it's more of a danger to itself than Shatter is to it. It's not going to quite be like Malice, who had a much more vulnerable weapon. I don't think the Shatter team will risk firing the hammer while Captain Shredderator is spinning, especially if they do have those Freedom Wings on, so they will probably lose some aggression points there. I think Captain Shredderator will do most of the damage, and while Shatter might take control due to its abilities to tank hits to the face, that probably won't be enough to swing the judges. So I'm going to go with Captain Shredderator here on our judge's decision. This would be very disappointing for Shatter to go 1-2 with only a win against Ghost Raptor. It seems to me that this fight is a win and you're in kind of affair, but mathematically we are going to get some 1-2 robots into the competition, so Shatter might just make it at a 30th seed or something like that. Same for Captain Shredderator. Win this and they are in. If they don't, they're really hoping for some mercy from the selection committee. The winner of this I can see being seeded somewhere between 18th and 22nd on the top 32. So here we have an interesting fight between two robots who have kind of similar strategies as one another. We have HiJinx, the colorful undercutter brought to us by geneburn, and we have Chomp, the powerful walking hammerbot brought to us by Zoe Stevenson. Now, I didn't actually get to preview Chomp because it debuted in episode 4, and that was an episode that sadly I missed out on previewing. So just quickly, Zoe Stevenson brought Chomp in season 1 where it was a crusher bot. It impressed selectors enough to get a wild card spot, but ended up going 0-2 anyway, as when it fought Ice Wave, it got completely torn apart. It came back in season 2 as a completely different design. This was Chomp's first iteration as a hammer bot, and where we also started to see how much innovation Zoe and Yasha were willing to pour into this machine. It surprised us all by making the top 8 and by defeating the reigning champion and eventual back-to-back champion Byte Force, and still stands as the only robot to defeat Paul Ventimiglia in Battlebots. Season 3 was a much less successful affair for Zoe Stevenson and Chomp, as it went 0-4 and looked frustrating with its very clumsy and haphazard style of fighting. Zoe and Yasha took season 4 off, and boy was it worth it. Here we have the new Chomp, a walking robot with a massively powerful hammer on the turret, kind of like a heavyweight version of Derek Young's pressure drop, or perhaps an evolved version of Gamatron. Speaking of whom, the descendant of Gamatron they actually beat in episode 4, and they were the first to taste the sheer power of Chomp's hammer. I've never really seen a robot's hammer go all the way through a robot and nearly to the base plate. So Chomp is at 1-0 and looking fairly impressive. They're up against HiJinx, who are at 1-1 after a disappointing loss against Claw Viper, where it didn't seem to have full mobility in its drive after a while of getting bashed about by Kevin Milczewski's robot. They then scored a win in an untelevised fight against Tracer, and it looked like they did to Tracer exactly what Ribot did. So they've definitely proved that their weapon has lethal enough power. Will it have enough strength to go through that tough side skirt of Chomp? If it's anything like the side armor of Chomp back in season 2 and 3, I'd say it's going to be pretty tough. I remember Captain Shredderator trying to do damage to Chomp and only really grazing off, leaving the robot completely undeterred by the attack. As I alluded to at the start of this segment, both robots kind of have a similar game plan: to sit in the middle of the battle box and wait for the opponent to come to them. It is very difficult to attack either of these robots from any angle without getting a taste of that weapon. When it comes to fighting each other, it's going to be interesting. From what I've seen, HiJinx is more mobile than Chomp. Those legs on it aren't particularly fast. I reckon Yasha will hold off on firing the weapon because it would be a huge risk letting that hammer come into contact with HiJinx's spinning bar. But having said that, when it does come down, I think HiJinx looks a little too spindly to stand up to that sort of power. And even if it does hit the weapon of HiJinx, it could possibly break it off. Sorta similar to the Malice versus Shatter fight. But in any case, while I wouldn't be surprised if HiJinx ended up winning this, I'm going to actually go for Chomp, and I'm going to say it'll be a knockout. This would leave Chomp at 2-0 in a very interesting spot. It has a weaker strength of schedule. However, the selection committee would no doubt want to see such an innovative robot in the round of 32, because it would be very interesting to see what it could do against some higher tier robots. So it's hard to say. Obviously a 1-2 HiJinx doesn't make it. A 2-1 HiJinx though looks interesting, but I don't know, with Huge and Rotator winning their fights last episode, it doesn't look like there are going to be that many vacancies for robots like HiJinx in the round of 32. Here we go with Battle 3 and another fight that might just be win and you're in. Will this be the last we see of either Claw Viper or Gigabyte, both of whom are at 1-1? We'll start with John Mladnik and Gigabyte. Their first fight was a spectacular loss against Copperhead, but they rebounded quite nicely with a win against Extinguisher. Not a particularly strong opponent for the veterans to beat, but you can only beat who you're put up against. And it was a fight that showed that they had just as much damage output as they have at any point in the past. Kevin Milczewski, in the meantime, with Claw Viper, is coming off a loss, and this one was against Black Dragon. A very good robot, top 16 last season, winner of the Desperado tournament, so no shame there, but it was the way it lost that was disappointing. I didn't expect Claw Viper to burst into flames in the way that it did, and there's no real explanation as to why that happened. Sure, Black Dragon did quite a bit of damage to it, but it didn't seem to sustain as many hard or heavy hits as it did in its fight against HiJinx, so it seems to me that perhaps this is a flaw with the electronics, and hopefully it's not something that's ongoing, since that fight against HiJinx back in episode 2 was very impressive. Claw Viper seems to have a lot of tricks up its sleeve, and while the electronics are suspect, the body of the robot itself seems very damage resistant. It was able to handle HiJinx pretty well, and that's a robot that you can't take on without actually getting hit, which does bode well for Claw Viper's chances here against Gigabyte. For that fight against HiJinx, Kevin fitted that strong wedge to the front and used it to great effect. I'd be very surprised if we don't see that wedge in this fight. I can't really find too many examples of John Mladnik and his robots fighting against a robot like Claw Viper. The best that I can is against Greedy Snake in King of Bots 2. It lost to it once in the opening rounds and was on the ropes when it actually fought it in the main competition, and was very lucky to get away with the victory. The obvious tactic here for Kevin Milcheski is to box rush, as it has been the past 2 fights. The problem for him is less about the speed and more about the accuracy of that box rush. If he can land it though, it will definitely set the tone of the fight, and Gigabyte will be on the back foot from the get-go. If Gigabyte is able to spin up, I'm not sure if it'll be able to do as much damage as it's used to. Claw Viper's an incredibly tough robot, and unless Gigabyte gets around the back and hits those exposed wheels, I can see that tough armor shrugging off the blows, no matter how strong they are. The problem here for Claw Viper, however, is reliability. It's made for a fight against Gigabyte, so that means it's more fighting against itself and whether or not it's going to burn up like it did in its fight against Black Dragon. It would be a real shame if it did. I think this is where Claw Viper can shine in a fight like this. I think it'll be able to outlast Gigabyte's weapon. That self-righting bar may even come off once again, and we could see Claw Viper put the suplex move on Gigabyte. So I'm thinking, honestly, Claw Viper will win this by knockout, and that would be very disappointing for John Mladnik and Gigabyte. They've tried and tried to get through to the top 16 in the past. No top 32 for them this season if they lose here. I just think there are too many good robots that are going to be at 1 and 2 that Gigabyte will be found wanting. A 2-1 Claw Viper, I reckon, makes it. I don't see why it wouldn't. It would be a huge snub, especially after a takedown of a big name like Gigabyte. At 1 and 2, however, there's no hope for Claw Viper. So I'm going to be honest, I never thought Craig Danby would be the man to decide Witchdoctor's fate in the competition this season, as here we have an 0-2 Witchdoctor going up against a 2-0 Slammow. And just quickly, since I didn't get to cover him in episode 4, Craig Danby has been competing for a long time. When Robot Wars rebooted, we saw him bring Foxic and also Apex, neither of which had much success at all, sadly. We also saw Foxic at Robo Games, where Craig was able to show off the durability of his robots, but sadly that didn't translate to much success in Battlebots, as what is known as the Danby curse really set in on his robots, Predator in Season 3 and Foxtrot in Season 4. Finally, he's been getting some victories with Slammo, with wins against Pain Train back in episode 4 and an untelevised fight against War Easy, which hopefully we'll get to see some footage of this episode. So if Craig was worried about his strength of schedule, this fight would make him think twice, because of course Witchdoctor is the runner-up from last year. I'm sure none of you need reminding of that, but they are coming off a shock loss against Kraken and a disappointing performance against Hydra. The main issue for Witchdoctor this season has definitely been their weapons. I'd contend that they would have beaten Hydra fairly convincingly had their weapon not broken during that fight. Kraken, I'm actually not so certain, since that robot was really built to counter vertical spinners, but Witchdoctor's season definitely would have looked a lot better if it weren't for a bad batch of weapon material, apparently.
That was terrible.
No, what can you do with the weapon broken? It broke right away.
I don't know what's been going on behind the scenes, obviously. I'm not sure if they have access to better weapon material while they're there at the event, but if they are, then I'd be worried if I were Craig Danby. In fact, I'd be worried no matter who I was coming up against Witchdoctor. Andrea and Mike Galately aren't going to take this fight lightly. Slammo is obviously fairly adept at taking out vertical spinners. It's dealt with 2 of them so far. Craig is known for making his robots durable, and now apparently he's making them reliable, so even if that weapon were completely indestructible, there's no guarantee that this would be an easy fight for Witchdoctor. Slammo did look a little bit sluggish in its fight against Pain Train, and if there's any team with a vertical weapon that can take advantage of that, it is Witchdoctor. I don't expect Slammo to be able to keep its front faced to Witchdoctor for the entire fight, and it's those moments where there will be an inevitable slip-up, or Slammo is simply caught out of position, that Witchdoctor will take advantage of and will do a lot of damage. And even if this does go to a judge's decision, those moments may be the ones that count more in Witchdoctor's favor than the rest of the fight does in Slammow's favor. So at the end of the day, I think it's going to be very difficult for Slammow to escape the fact that Witchdoctor can do damage to them, be that fatal damage or just something that helps them in a judge's decision. It seems to me that Slammow will be durable enough. While it might be the wiser choice to go for a KO in this fight, I actually think I'm going to have faith in Craig Danby, and I'm going to say it's going to be a judge's decision. It's going to be to Witchdoctor, but I reckon Slammow will make a very good fist of it. This would put Craig Danby at 2-1. He's going to have a great shot at getting into the top 32. With that, it'll be a lower seeding, obviously, but with a lot of these 1-on-1 robots facing off against each other, that provides the perfect environment for a robot like Slammow to make their end of season tournament. A 1-2 Witchdoctor will obviously make it in. They'll be one of the few 4 or 5 perhaps 1-2 robots to make it, if that, but there's no way that the selection committee will pass up on them. Does an 0-3 Witchdoctor make it? It's a toss of a coin for me. It's a TV show, they want the most entertaining robots there. However, 0-3 is a bit of an insult to robots that actually want to fight during the main season. Oh, and I'm calling my shot right here. I reckon a 1-2 Witchdoctor will be seeded 16th or 17th. A 1-2 Tombstone, 16th or 17th. They're going to be fighting it out in the first round of the top 32 if Witchdoctor wins here. Extinguisher has really not gotten a break this season, have they? First up, they fought against Perfect Phoenix, which admittedly was a bit of an unknown quantity. Then they draw Gigabyte, a terrifying full body spinner, and now they're up against Gruff. Perhaps not ranked as highly as the selection committee as I have ranked it, but still a robot that everyone knows is capable of going toe-to-toe with some of the best. So as I mentioned, Extinguisher is at 0-2, Gruff, on the other hand, is at 1-1, after burning out Will Bales and Hypershock, but they're getting absolutely dominated by Whiplash in what was ultimately a judge's decision. However, it was pretty clear from the fight who was on top throughout that entire match. Now I just wanted to mention, yes, throughout my previews and predictions, I have been hyping up Extinguisher's new weapon setup, the vertical spinner that makes them look a little bit like a red Witchdoctor. Finally, they've previewed that on their Facebook page, so it looks like we're actually going to see it in this episode for this fight against Gruff. I guess against the horizontal spinners, they wanted to keep their tough wedge on the front. It seems that that wedge doesn't go on with the vertical spinner. I'm not entirely sure, but now it looks like they have a chance to actually use it here. Thing is though, Sam McAmis goes alright against vertical spinners. Gruff is generally built to take them on. He really only gets dominated by them if they are able to outmaneuver him, as Whiplash did. And while he hasn't had that much success in actually beating them, not in Battlebots anyway, he's always been there or thereabouts in the judge's decision, and well, he's only going to get better at handling his robot against them. Gruff is obviously tough as nails, very difficult to knock out. It hasn't happened often during Battlebots, and Extinguisher's weapon is, well, it's only very new. It's untested, it looks vicious, I'm excited to see it, but it's obviously hard to tell how long it's going to last when it's actually coming into contact with another robot. When a control-y, clampy, lifty type robot goes up against a vertical spinner, it often comes down to driving, and along with that, just the sheer amount of damage that the vertical spinner can dish out, and therefore the durability of the more controlling robot. So while this sort of matchup may often be in the favor of the robot with the vertical spinner, it's hard to go against the experience of Sam McAmis, the toughness of Gruff, and just simply the fact that this is a new weapon being used by an inexperienced team. But this could potentially be the beginning of a new era for Extinguisher. While I don't expect it to win here, that vertical spinner could perform better than we expect, and it could be the main module that they actually go forward with in coming seasons. But as I said, I'm expecting Gruff to win this. Whether or not it's a KO or a judge's decision is an interesting case. I think it's probably going to be a judge's decision. I can see Extinguisher lasting the full 3 minutes. The only way Gruff will knock it out is if it completely burns it out. But yeah, I can see this one going the distance, to the credit of John Flack and team. So this would put Extinguisher at 0-3, obviously. It's pretty understandable. They fought 3 very good robots, and it's only their second year of competing. Gruff, meanwhile, will go 2-1, and I don't see any reason why they should be left out of the top 32. It could just scrape into the top 10, but I'm gonna say it'll be seated somewhere between 11 and 14. You know, it's a good robot, and I think it can make an impact in the postseason tournament. So you know when you were a kid and you got your Matchbox cars or your Robot Wars toys or something like that, and you'd make them fight against one another? It feels like that's what Ray Billings is kind of doing here, only on a much larger scale. So we've got his two proteges, Tyler Nguyen and Yash Desmukh, in other words the captains of Perfect Phoenix and Atom 94, facing off against one another in this, the 6th fight of episode 9. Atom 94 has had a pretty rough season thus far. They lost out to the Big Dill after getting stuck on its weapon. It then fought against Tantrum, and if this was a fight between purely the weapons, Atom 94 would have come out on top. However, the robot itself lacks durability and lacks reliability. It also seemed to lack traction on the arena floor. So with that, the ability to actually point the weapon at Tantrum, and Aaron Hill completely exploited both of those factors, resulting in a pretty quick knockout.
That might have been the kill shot right there.
Perfect Phoenix, on the other hand, scored a very quick knockout against Extinguisher in its first fight. Looked impressive there. It looked impressive at the start of its fight against Scorpios as well. The weapon was powerful enough to put off Scorpios' charge, at least for a bit, but then the weapon broke, and Zach Lytle was always going to be able to outmaneuver and outpush Perfect Phoenix from that position. I think the face of Atom 94 puts Perfect Phoenix at an advantage since it seems like there is an edge to catch. So unless the Indian-Canadian team pulls out an alternate wedge at the front, I'd say Perfect Phoenix will be able to catch the wedges at the side or the weapon at the side and do some damage or disable the weapon or something like that. After the first couple of hits, so long as Perfect Phoenix's weapon is still working, I'm expecting Tyler Nguyen to go in and start causing damage to the more vulnerable back of Atom 94. Their lack of control makes it seem like it'll be very tricky for them to constantly have their weapon facing Perfect Phoenix, as was the case in both their fights against Big Dill and Tantrum. Their best shot is for that first hit to disable Perfect Phoenix's weapon, and from that point forward they can probably dominate the fight even if they don't have perfect control, but they're gonna have to be very, very lucky for that to occur. So honestly, I reckon Perfect Phoenix will win this. It'll win it by knockout. I don't expect Atom 94 to go the distance here, especially with the damage output from Perfect Phoenix. If that remains consistent, then Atom 94 has very little chance. This would be very interesting because it would put Perfect Phoenix at 2-1. It would mean we've got another 2-1 robot, but this time one with a little less pedigree. It's a bit more of an unknown quantity when going up against the marquee robots of Battlebots. I mean, yeah, perhaps the pedigree is not the problem, since it was built by Paul Ventimiglia and improved by Ray Billings, so maybe it's just more accurate to say it lacks history in modern Battlebots. I still expect it to see combat in the top 32. I'd put it somewhere around 25th to 28th, in that kind of area. Because of that lack of history, yes, but also because both of its opponents ended up going 0-3, if my predictions for this fight and the previous fight go as I expect them to. Atom 94 will be at 0-3, obviously. That's okay, they showed their weapon has quite a lot of power behind it, and as a protege of Ray Billings, I expect to see this team again. Alright, here we have the main event, and what would it be but the clash of two robots at 2-0. This is Zach Goff and Copperhead up against Gabriel Silverteles and Black Dragon. Copperhead dominated both of its fights this season, first up against Gigabyte, completely ripping that weapon/shell off of it, and then against P1 where it was basically a 2-hit knockout. Zach Goff and team has all made it look very, very easy this season. Black Dragon, on the other hand, I would say isn't in as good form as they were last season. They did very well then. Beating Minotaur in the Desperado final is still probably the peak of their Battlebots career thus far, and while they were very impressive against Claw Viper in their last match, they were run very, very close by Kraken, which, while it's no joke, is a very unconventional robot, and many would say that perhaps Matsberg deserved that judge's decision rather than Black Dragon. But here is the Brazilian team at 2-0, along with Copperhead in its first main event. So fights between vertical spinners often come down to what is at the front of the robot. In its famous victory against fellow Brazilian team Minotaur, Black Dragon used a solid wedge with 2 front forks, and while they won that fight, that wedge wasn't always reliably getting underneath Minotaur. Against Lockjaw, they used just a solid flat wedge, and those forks of Lockjaw countered that perfectly.
This is total domination by Lockjaw right now.
In the pits, we've seen the wedge that Black Dragon plans to use against other vertical spinners this season, and it seems to be a version of the wedge they used against Minotaur, but with larger wedges instead of those 2 smaller forks. Against Copperhead and those flatter wedges coming around the sides, it's going to be really interesting to see who ends up winning the ground game. Of course, that's not necessarily what Copperhead will run with, but it's what they used against the one vertical spinner they came up against in Season 4, Warhawk, and it worked pretty well there. I'll admit I haven't been too impressed by Black Dragon's weapon, not just this season but in general. The Egg Beater Spinner doesn't seem to be the robot's best asset. That has to be the driving, its balance and stability, how fast it is, and the fact that it's an incredibly durable robot. The weapon, however, isn't the most durable, but as we saw in its fight against Minotaur, the robot itself just seems to have enough attack power anyway, even if the weapon does go down. The thing about Copperhead though is that I think that weapon will just simply outmuscle Black Dragon. Even if it manages to only get the better of a couple of head-to-head exchanges, those will be enough to turn the fight and allow Goff to target other areas of Black Dragon. I'm not certain that Black Dragon's weapon will survive the whole fight, as it has a history of breaking down, and I can see Copperhead taking full advantage of that. I can also see the flatter wedge setup of Copperhead being enough to get underneath that new layout of Black Dragon. At the end of the day, I'm predicting this to be a very close battle, but I can see Black Dragon probably taking way too many big hits from Copperhead. I'm not convinced that Copperhead will be able to knock Black Dragon out, since no one's been able to knock Black Dragon out just yet throughout its Battlebots career, but I reckon those big hits will be enough to swing it in favor of Copperhead if it goes to the judges, and that is what I think will happen. Black Dragon may be able to take control and aggression for the most part, as it did against Minotaur, but I don't know, I've just been way too impressed by Copperhead's weapon this season, and even if Goff doesn't drive as well as Black Dragon, it doesn't matter as much because that weapon is compensating for any lack of control they might have over the fight. So this would put Copperhead at 3-0. This is a top 5 robot, top 4 robot maybe this season. If that happens, they're going to make a deep run into the tournament. I wouldn't sleep on them if I were you. These are major contenders this season. Black Dragon are also major contenders this season. Let's not fool ourselves here. But slipping to 2-1, they get a bit of a harder match in the first round of 32. I can still see them making it deep, however, so this loss is just going to be a speed bump on the road to pretty bright things for the Brazilian team. Alright, that is it. That's all the battles for this episode covered. Just to recap my predictions, we've got Captain Shredderator, Chomp, and Claw Viper all by knockout, Witchdoctor and Gruff by judge's decision, Perfect Phoenix by knockout, and Copperhead by judge's decision in the main event. We're only a couple of episodes away from the round of 32. I can't wait, it's really heating up now. By the end of this episode, most robots will have completed their fight night schedule, and we'll have a very clear idea as to who's making it and who's not. But that's all I have time for now. Thank you for watching previews and predictions for Battlebots Season 5, Episode 9. Like it if you like it, chuck a comment in the box, drink some water, wear a mask if that's appropriate in your local jurisdiction, and I'll see you next time.